Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to our school project in the form of a podcast. I am joined here by my colleague Jiri Cernohous. My name is Jiri Dokoupil, and this podcast will focus on Israel's nuclear weapons and Israel's underlying policies connected to nuclear weapons. This podcast will be separated into two main parts. In the first part, Jiri and myself will talk briefly about the history of Israel's nuclear program. Then we'll join talk about the NPT and Israel, why it did not join, what were the reasons for that, and some underlying aspects. And we'll close the first part off by talking about some current capabilities of Israel and the nuclear weapons. And in the second part, we will be joined by an honored guest, Dr. Or Rabinowitz, all the way from San Francisco. And we will talk about some more specific details of Israel's nuclear policy with her. So definitely looking forward to that in part 2. So to start things off, let's begin with the first topic, and that would be how the motivations and how Israel actually acquired its nuclear weapons and the story behind that.
Okay, so the history behind this starts with, I would say, three main actors. The first is the first Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, and his reasoning behind the program. There were several factors which he influenced by. The first is definitely the first Israeli-Palestinian war, or the Arab conflict in general. Also the rhetoric of the Arab leaders, and as well the disproportionate disadvantage, because there were so few Israelis and so many Arabs, with the area much bigger, the conventional army much larger, but the quality is better than quantity. So that was it. That was the reason why. And then we need someone who will provide it. So the first was the United States. After the Eisenhower administration, the attempts for peace or the cooperation treaty between Israel and the United States began in 1955. The US provided just the research nuclear reactor, not the one who is capable of producing plutonium or uranium, so they can produce its own nuclear weapons. So it was just for research and the energy sector. The Israelis didn't like that because they were still endangered by the Arab coalition. So the tensions began to rise between the US and the Israelis, but then the new actor came to the region, and it was France. France was like fading superpower, and they wanted to establish presence in the region when the United States left. So they were willing to provide some nuclear reactor which is capable of producing nuclear weapons eventually. And so they started a cooperation in Negev desert.
In the Negev desert, yeah, I think that was it.
And then the Suez Crisis started, and the tensions on the international field was heating up. So eventually French withdrew from this cooperation, but they managed to build a reactor, so Israelis had finally the capabilities. But then the US found out about this, and they started investigation. They were really against it, but the Nixon's administration came in, and they were not really against it. They were like, don't admit it, you can have it. They were not really insisting on getting rid of the nuclear weapons from Israel.
Yeah, exactly. As you've said, I think what is important to connect in this part as well is that France was the most prominent overall military provider of equipment for Israel at the time as well, right? So, so it was kind of connected to the overall help France was already giving to Israel. So it was just another part of that dynamic. But as you've mentioned, we have France fanning out at the US in the 60s, finding out that Israel has the capabilities for producing nuclear weapons, right? Maybe already having them. The CIA and the FBI already all over that. And we have 1968, right? The
Yes.
NPT. NPT comes along, and we have the problem with Israel. Now, the US pushes Israel, obviously, to sign the NPT, right? It would look bad if it wouldn't, as its closest allies, to give them some special treatment. The thing is, Israel couldn't, due to how the treaty was set up, join the NPT as a nuclear weapon state, basically, because only states that manufactured and tested a nuclear weapon before the year 1967 could be a nuclear weapon state to the treaty. Now, Israel maybe fits this categorization, but it didn't do so officially, right? That's the problem. It needed to be official in this regard, right? So it could only join as a nuclear non-weapon state into the treaty. Now, that's a huge problem for Israel, right? Because it would defeat the whole purpose of why they wanted nuclear weapons in the first place. Now, the US pushes them to join, so they set up these ridiculous like assurances that they would need, that the US would need to reassure Israel of, like better security in the region, like the Soviet Union would need to guarantee that it would stop directly supporting militarily some of the Arab states that threaten Israel, which was impossible for the US and the Soviet Union to cooperate in this instance. So basically, Israel set up these conditions that couldn't be upheld by the US, so they knew they wouldn't join the NPT, right? And as you've said, there comes the Nixon administration, right? And the push for Israel actually joining the NPT slows down. There is this famous deal. It is not like a treaty, but it's more of a verbal deal between Nixon and then Prime Minister of Israel Golda Meir in 1969, where the US makes a deal with Israel that they will stop their investigations and controls of the nuclear facilities in Israel, or start digging into that. But Israel needs to stop, or needs to reassure US that it will not test its nuclear weapons, and it would not officially admit to having those nuclear weapons, because that would put a bad spotlight right on the US, because it's an ally to kind of this rogue state that's not part of the NPT, and the dynamic would kind of be put off balance. Now, this has huge implications for the nuclear order in the world at the time, right? You have all of the 5 like known major players that have nuclear weapons in the NPT, and most of the other states actually in the region of Middle East as well joining the NPT, right? And the only one not actually joining is the only state that has the nuclear capabilities and is not the safeguards are not implemented on them. They are under basically no supervision, right, from the side of the NPT or any states in the region. Now, this obviously doesn't make the Arab states happy, right? So they continuously push for Israel to either join the NPT, or basically at almost any review conference that is present for the NPT, right? Arabs always raise the issue of Israel as one of the main topics. It's like the number one topic when an NPT review conference is being held, right? And what the Arab states actually tried to do and to work around this problem a little bit is that they tried to establish or push for the establishment of a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, right? If they can't get Israel to actually join the NPT, to pressure it and to give up its nuclear weapons, they somehow wanted to come up with a different solution, right? Through this, one of the most prominent actors in this is Egypt, that pushes for this at almost every review conference and every possibility they get, right? Or for example, Iran also tried to push for these weapons of mass destruction free zone, but they were, you could say, somewhat frustrated that the progress wasn't as fast as they would hope. And so they actually started, venturing into their own nuclear program and maybe trying to get their own nuclear weapons to counter Israel. So this is like the main dynamic at this point, right? Iran trying to get nuclear weapons, not trying to get nuclear weapons to counter Israel. So this is very important to mention as well. And what is also important to mention, in my view, with the WMD free zone is that Israel actually proposed this free zone as well, right? But it again repeated that it is absolutely imperative for Israel that there will be sufficient safeguards and assurances that the Arab states wouldn't easily break off from the NPT or from the weapons of mass destruction free zone, and thus endanger Israel directly, right? Because if we would give up the nuclear weapons and then after some time, let's say 5-10 years, Arab states would switch their position and actually leave all these treaties behind and try and pursue nuclear weapons, that's like one of the biggest fears that Israel has with joining any of these treaties and these initiatives. It is, and last thing in this topic, I think it's important to say that Israel actually joined the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, right? Which is actually not surprising, because if you think about it, they already have a kind of a hidden secret deal with the US to not test their nuclear weapons. So, right, it's kind of like they're saying we don't have nuclear weapons, but we're signing a treaty that says we won't test them. So I think that's an interesting dynamic as well in this regard.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Jiri. But like, I mean, the question, what the nuclear weapon free zone today, it's like, it used to be a huge dream, like the wish for all of Middle East, but it's not really unmanageable, because I mean, we managed to have like peace treaty with Egypt in 79, with Jordan in 94, and latest was 2020, I think, with the United Arab Emirates, because now Israel is not the greatest enemy for Arabs. It's like Iran and its theocratic regime. So that's like something which would push people like Arab nations to acknowledge Israel and bring more stability into the region.
Yeah, definitely. I think you've mentioned an excellent point there, and I want to mention this point with Dr. Rabinowitz in the second part, and that's the shifting political landscape in the region, right? As you've said, Iran is becoming the main threat not only to Israel, which obviously it is, but it's also becoming one of the main threats for the other Arab states instead of Israel. Now, for example, Saudi Arabia actually doesn't push for the weapons of mass destruction free zone that much, because it believes that Israel's nuclear weapons actually keep Iran in check, right? So that's an excellent point you've definitely made there. But as we've said, Israel has not admitted to officially have nuclear weapons, and obviously this comes with a certain social discourse in the country as well, something very nicely called Amimut. So if you could maybe tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, of course. So the Amimut is a Hebrew term for the policy of ambiguity. So the official statement of the Israeli government is we don't have nuclear weapons, or we maybe have them, but we are surely would not be the first one to introduce nuclear weapons to the region. That's the official statement. And I think this was stated in the negotiations with the US in the 70s, I guess.
I think it was
I think with Nixon. Yeah, but this policy is quite unique because the Israels, like if we look at through neorealism perspective, it's a good deterrent policy to have nukes. Like, why would what would they attack us? But they don't do that. They are really pursuing something else. And if you look at the main pillars of this policy, we are giving small hints that we might have them, might not. And that's why we don't have to join to the NTP treaty. Also, there is this thing about secrecy we have in this policy because we can't openly acknowledge them. But this playing game of this policy gives several advantages. For example, the sanctions were not put on Israel during the development. Development was long, but they managed. So definitely it's beneficial.
Yeah, and I think the interesting point you've said, it's not only the political leaders and representatives in Israel acting in compliance with Amimut, right? But it's also the people, right? The discourse around the country, in the media, right? So I guess you had some censorship as well about the topic from the government, the media.
So yeah, definitely. Yeah. But like in a general public, you have to, if you look at Iran, for example, they are so proud of their civilian nuclear program, and Israelis are the same. Like they are proud of it, but they will not acknowledge it. It's the same thing. But this besiege mentality, it's like a good thing to have it because they are like, they sleep better at night because they are knowing that they are somehow protected, but they will not acknowledge that.
The psychological factor definitely plays a huge role in that. Yeah, so I guess we should now maybe talk about some of the current capacities. As you've mentioned, the main nuclear facility is in Dimona. That's in the Negev Desert, down in the southeastern part of the country. And we also have a second, I think that's just an experimental reactor in soccer, I think. So they have these two facilities, right? What is also really beneficial and important for Israel is that they have massive capabilities for deploying these nuclear weapons, right? They have a long history of successful ballistic missile programs, right? The Jericho ballistic missiles, Jericho 2 and 3. They have a huge range, thousands of kilometers. They could hit basically whatever target they wish, definitely in the Middle East and even beyond the borders of the Middle East. They also acquired submarines capable of carrying nuclear warheads and delivering them. I think that was from Germany. It's the I think it's a Dolphin class submarine, if I'm not mistaken. So it is also important for Israel to have these capabilities, right? Because you can have nuclear weapons, but if you do not have the necessary technology and the ballistic missiles to actually carry them, you're not as scary, right? In the region, like the other states, if they would know this, but no, they know Israel has both the nuclear warheads and the capabilities to deliver them. I think Israel at this point is estimated to have around, I don't know, 90 nuclear warheads, like somewhere around that number, which would actually make it quite a, if we would connect that back to the NPT, it would actually make it like more prominent in terms of nuclear warhead numbers than, let's say, France, that actually helped it develop its program, and the UK, right? It would be a major player. And it's also important to note that they implement the policy of actually having exclusively and only them having nuclear weapons in the region, right? With some of the bombing raids in, let's say, Syria or Iraq, with Iraq and Iraq destroying suspected nuclear weapons facilities in neighboring hostile countries.
Yeah, I definitely agree. But like if you have, for example, 90 nuclear warheads, but if we look back then, for example, there was in the Amimut policy, there is this like hidden clause, we would say it's Samson option, I think. And that's like, we will use nuclear weapons only if the survival of Israel is threatened. And this was, for example, really feared during the 6-Day War, because that was the war when Israel could lose, but they managed to win. But if it would happen, they would most likely use them because they had them back in the day. Like that's what the academics agree on. And that's like scary. But the Amimut policy really managed to be like not a product of just we want to do it like this. I think it was a compromise because it was a balancing act, because it ensured the avoidance of international, for example, intervention, and managed to keep the domestic elites in check. So to maintain the balance and everybody happy and ensure Israel's survival.
Yeah, that's an excellent point with the last resort policy, only using it when the existence of the state of Israel is actually threatened, right? And as you've said, you've had the 6-Day War and you've had the Yom Kippur War, right? In 73, I think it was. And those were like big wars, right? Like those two last big wars between the Arab states directly and not some non-state organizations and Israel, and they almost didn't even think about using nuclear weapons because they were so confident in their conventional ability to defend themselves that they've said, okay, it's not even a question. It's like really, as you've said, the last resort. And I think that's an important takeaway that we could end this part on. So to connect this to the second part, as we've mentioned previously, Dr. Rabinowitz will join us and will talk about some of the aspects we've mentioned previously in greater detail. So definitely stay tuned for the second part of our podcast. Okay, so everybody, welcome to the second part of our podcast on Israeli nuclear policy, strategy, and nuclear weapons. For the second part, as we have talked about, we have our wonderful host here, Dr. Rabinowitz, all the way from San Francisco. Hello, doctor.
Hi. Hi.
Could just start maybe with a quick introduction. If you could talk a little bit about yourself, what do you specialize in your academic career? So if you could start with that, please.
So thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Or Rabinowitz. I'm an Israeli academic. I work at the Hebrew University of Israel in Jerusalem. I'm a tenured associate professor at the International Relations Department. This year, I'm on my sabbatical. I'm spending it as an Israel Studies Fellow at Stanford University at a center called CSAC. And my academic fields of interest relate to nuclear proliferation, nuclear history, Israel-US relations, but specifically I'm interested in nuclear proliferation, the Israeli case and other cases as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we can start with the first topic, and that is Israel's motivation for keeping its nuclear weapon program a secret. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Israel is in possession of approximately 90 nuclear weapons, but they do not officially admit them. My question is, what are the reasons for Israel's decisions not to officially admit to having nuclear weapons, and are they strictly security-oriented, or is there possibility of another reason?
So I think it's a great question. It's difficult to answer it in a very short manner because it basically pertains to Israeli history in general and Israel's nuclear history more specifically, but we'll try to answer this in a short and concise manner. So first of all, does Israel have nuclear weapons? I think they do. Most scholars think they do. They haven't officially acknowledged it, but we need to separate the two issues. The fact that we don't have an official Israeli acknowledgement gives us no reason to think that Israel is not in possession of nuclear weapons. Which brings me to my second point, which I find very, very important to stress to people who are, just interested in the topic and are just starting to read up on it. Israel doesn't deny having nuclear weapons. Israel doesn't go basically up to the world and say, we don't have anything, we don't know what you're talking about. It's not the official policy. The official policy, as it basically crystallized in the 60s and going forward, is a very short, concise line, which I will tell you now. Israel will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons to the region. That's it, that's the entire policy. And the Israeli leadership still adheres to it. And as we can all glean from this sentence, there isn't a point in the sentence which basically say, we don't have anything, right? Or when I say we, I mean Israel, because I'm Israeli, so sometimes I misspeak and I say we, even though you have to trust me that it's not my decision. So that's the official policy. Initially in the 1960s, as Israel was developing its nuclear weapons program, it did it secretly. It didn't want the US and other world powers to pressure it into not having nuclear weapons or to dismantling it. So it basically just proceeded quietly. It bought its plutonium producing reactor from France when the two countries still had a close relationship. It started in the late 50s. The agreement was signed in the late 50s, and then construction started. And we think that this reactor probably started producing plutonium around 63. It's important to note that there were no international norms against these actions as early as the early 1960s. So the US, the Soviets, the British, the French, the Chinese were doing it. We think that Israel was probably the sixth. That's our assumption in the scholarly community. But there weren't any norms, and none of the major nuclear treaties were yet in force. The most central one, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, only opened up for signature in 1968. So when we talk about norms and the normative landscape, we can't use the NPT to judge things that happened in the late 50s or the early 60s. So Israel thought that the best idea would be to keep it secret, to make sure that the US and other important actors wouldn't basically pressure it to stop. And they probably also thought that it would be a good idea not to, quote unquote, shove it in the face of the Arab world and the Egyptians. I don't think they wanted to push the Egyptians into an equivalent arms race. I don't think they wanted to see an Egyptian effort to match that capability. Egypt was the most prominent rival for Israel in the 1960s. A lot of things have changed since. Israel and Egypt are enjoying a peaceful relationship since 1979. So it's not, things have changed. And what happened in 1969 is that Israel and the US reached a famous understanding. It's called the Nixon-Meyer deal. And we think that in this understanding, Israel and the US basically decided to manage the nuclear relationship, meaning that we think that Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir told Nixon that Israel will not test, declare, or otherwise just threaten its neighbors with its nuclear capabilities. And the US would just remove the issue from the bilateral agenda. We think this is what happened because there aren't any official documents. So basically, this is a very interesting assumption, working assumption, but enough sources have become available, which basically corroborated our assumption. So we feel very comfortable, meaning myself and any other researcher working on Israel's nuclear history, we feel very, very solid in our assumption that this is what happened. And since 1969, things have remained the same. So we're now recording our podcast on January 9th, 2023. The understanding I just told you is still the understanding which governs US-Israel relations in the Israeli realm. I think the major motivation, and now I'm actually answering your question, I think the major motivation for reaching this deal from the Israeli perspective is the ability to manage US-Israel relations, but it is a security aspect. So a lot of it it's mostly a security rationale. It's not, I don't think we can or should basically say that Israel-US relations or the relationship between US and Israel has nothing to do with security. I think it has a lot to do with security, and I think this is an expression of that. So that's my answer in a nutshell.
Yeah, definitely. So basically a combination of the base that is security related and then some political motives connected to the relations with the US. Yeah.
But I think that these political motives were how the Israeli leadership perceived security. I don't think it was personal.
In Israel, it's kind of intertwined, right? Politics and security. It's almost.
But for the US as well, I think it's everywhere.
Yeah.
I think that the US also wanted it from a security perspective because they wanted, and we have actually memos by Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor at the time, saying, well, if the Arabs knew that Israel was nuclear, for sure, this would push them to the arms of the Russians and they would try to get nuclear weapons themselves. So from an American security perspective, the decision that was made was to make sure that this bomb wouldn't become commonly known. And the understanding was that this would reduce the likelihood that the Arabs would strengthen the relationship with Moscow and try to get a bomb for themselves. So this is also a security thing.
Yeah, this is an excellent bridge to the second topic that we want to discuss, and that is the security implications of Israel having nuclear weapons in the region. So what I wanted to ask you is, do you think that Israel having nuclear weapons actually increased its security, or could it somehow have tempered this security? Because as we know from theory and practice, when a state gets a nuclear weapon, then its neighbors, of course, as was shown by reactions of several Arab states, or for example, Iran, at this moment, they feel threatened and want to chase their own nuclear programs as well, thus endangering the state that originally acquired nuclear weapons. So do you think that nuclear weapons increased Israel's safety or security, or maybe somehow endangered it a little bit?
So I will challenge a few of the assumptions that were implied in your question. I don't think that the Israeli nuclear weapons basically initiated an original arms race. The Egyptians, who were the main rivals of Israel, didn't initiate a nuclear weapons program following Israel's nuclearization. I don't think that the Iranians' motivation to go nuclear has anything to do with Israel. Iran and Israel are more than 1,000 kilometers apart. They do not share a border, and Israel doesn't threaten Iran. Iran isn't a part of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Iran is, in fact, not an Arab country. So I don't think the Israeli nuclear weapons program has anything to do with Iran's decision to go nuclear. I think that other things are related to that, especially Iranian impression of and lessons learned from the Iran-Iraq conflict. So we won't go into that, but I think it was a major trauma for the Iranians. And if you remember, then Saddam Hussein instigated what we now call the war on the cities. So ballistic missiles were basically launched at civilian population in cities. Both sides then retaliated, but I think that's a major motivation for Iran to go nuclear. I don't think it's Israel's nuclear program. And of course, we need to talk about Iraq and Syria. So I'm not gonna, ignore that, and I'll put a little apostrophe there, and we can go back to that. I think that the Israeli nuclear weapons program isn't the biggest problem in the Middle East. I don't think it damaged Israel's security. I think that Israeli security is mostly damaged, and this is a political statement that I'm going to make, by the leadership's insistence to maintain the occupation and to prevent a two-state solution. And I think this is the biggest hurdle towards Israel's assimilation in the region. I think that's the biggest problem. That's my perception as an Israeli, as someone who does security studies. I think that the security problems emanating from Israel's nuclear program is almost zero. Israel has been, up until now, a responsible nuclear player. So, I don't think that the countries in the Middle East live in fear of an Israeli sudden, nuclear attack wiping out the Middle East. I can say for a fact, it's not something that they fear. When Israel took out the Iraqi reactor in 1981, most Arab leaders accepted it with a huge sigh of relief, especially the Egyptians. There is a tendency outside the Middle East to view all the Arabs as this one monolithic chunk of states which all support each other and behave the same and could be more, removed from the truth. So I think that Israel's nuclear weapons program probably assisted Israel in convincing some of the Arab states to make peace with it. But I think it might have also deluded some people in the leadership into thinking that they can maintain the status quo and maintain the occupation, which in my opinion is the most dangerous thing for Israel's security. And what I just said isn't a consensus in Israel. It's removed from the consensus. I don't represent anyone else but myself here. And it's definitely not something that the new government accepts. I think that from an Israeli perspective, I'll rephrase it. I know from fact, from reading the documents and doing my works, that from the 1990s onwards, the leadership was very much aware of the chances that some other country in the Middle East will become nuclear during the 90s or later, and they especially feared Iraq and Iran because Saddam Hussein in 91 was just caught red-handed with the secret nuclear weapons program. So the Israelis were concerned either with Iraq or Iran, and some were also fearful of Syria. It wasn't clear what the Syrians were up to back then. And some people in the Israeli leadership said that we have to start thinking and planning towards a day when Israeli nuclear hegemony will basically end. And in the 90s, what they thought, something that I agree with, but the current government doesn't agree with, is that if you really want to hedge against the emergence of a second nuclear rival in the Middle East, you should strive to end the Israeli-Arab conflict. In the 90s, they were especially concerned with the Palestinian track and the Syrian track. The Syrian track now does not exist, but Palestinian track certainly exists. Basically make sure that Israel manages to create regional alliances, especially, and we say regional alliances, we're basically using another term for Saudi Arabia. People don't actually understand that. Saudi Arabia is the most important regional actor that Israel doesn't have the relationship it would want, or it wants to, with. And this will, and of course, and strengthen the special relationship with the US, while also maintaining its ability to project nuclear deterrence. And these three branches in the 1990s were conceptualized as, the right security answer to the predicament of an emerging nuclear actor, a second actor in the Middle East. It's not the case today. It's not the current policy. The current policy has nothing to do with resolving the Palestinian conflict or Israel-Palestinian conflict. The Saudis are very adamant on not moving forward to normalize relations with Israel as long as nothing happens on the Palestinian tract. And the relationship with the US, I foresee an imminent decline. And this is where we're at.
Yeah, we'll sort of get to the relationship with the US in the final part, and US is kind of pressure to maybe push Israel to join the NPT and kind of push back on its nuclear program, but we'll definitely get to that. So we should continue with some
other
more implications.
You already touched the topic. Israel has a history of bombing some other states' nuclear programs, such as Osirak in 1991 and in 2007, the Al-Kibar in Syria. My question is there a possibility that even in the near future, we could see similar bombing rates?
Of course, there is a possibility. If Israel discovers, a secret nuclear facility and the situation indicates that the best way to deal with it is a bombing raid, they'll do it. It may actually be right, by the way. I'm not in a position to a priori say that it's not going to be the right response. But it also doesn't mean that this is what will happen in the Iranian scenario. In Iraq and in Syria, the target was a plutonium-producing facility, and it was a single facility. So you could actually take it with an airstrike, and they did. In the Iranian case, we're talking about a program that is centered around uranium enrichment. To enrich uranium, you do not need a reactor. You just need a big room with centrifuges, so aluminum tubes, which spin quickly. You can do it in several places around your country. You can hide them. You can just pack a few centrifuges away in case something happens to the existing ones. You can always produce new centrifuges. So striking a facility that enriches uranium, especially when a country is maybe preparing for that option, isn't necessarily going to promote it, because it's not that difficult to produce new centrifuges and just place them. Or maybe many centrifuges have already been produced and you just basically take them out from storage. So you don't need to build a reactor. So the tactical response may not be necessarily a bombing raid. A bombing raid may not necessarily be the exact thing that you're going, or the best thing to delay or thwart such an effort. But yes, I think that if Israel discovers a secret nuclear facility in a hostile country, let's say if they discovered another Syrian reactor that's about to go hot, yes, I think it's a possibility. And I'll tell you something else. I don't think it's a bad possibility if you're facing a situation where you have a ruthless dictator like Bashar al-Assad, who's happily, using chemical weapons on his civilians, and on the side he's also trying to build a plutonium-producing plant. Maybe it's not the worst idea to bomb that plutonium-producing reactor as it's being built. Who here would like to face a nuclear-armed Bashar al-Assad?
Yeah, I think nobody in the region would want that, but that would be a question for a larger debate, I think. I wanted to touch on one point you've mentioned before, and that's the Saudi Arabia factor, right? It's a major, the third of the top three, right? Israel, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, the top three players in the region. And Saudi Arabia is actually a big proponent of establishing weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, right? Do you somehow feel that this is sort of a play at mitigating Israel's influence and trying to get rid of its nuclear weapons, to diminish, as you've said, its special ace cards in questions like in Palestinian occupation and such?
So the Saudis are actually not the biggest proponents. The biggest proponents of creating a nuclear free zone in the Middle East as a part of the WMD free zone are the Egyptians. And the Saudis are just going along with emotions, but they're not huge proponents of these diplomatic initiatives. And I'm going to say something that may surprise you. I don't think that the Saudis want to see Israel relinquish its nuclear weapons. I think that they foresee something akin to an Israeli nuclear umbrella over them in the rivalry against Iran should relations improve. Not a nuclear umbrella in the sense of NATO or the US relationship with South Korea and Japan, but a sort of a countering factor, and actually don't think that the Saudis want to see Israel disarm. So, but I'm sure that should Iran cross the threshold, I'm convinced that they will try to get nuclear weapons of their own. The reason I'm convinced is that they actually said so publicly and they're not hiding it. The Saudis are members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They are basically committed to be non-nuclear weapon states. But the NPT is a treaty from which countries can also withdraw. North Korea is an example of a country that has actually withdrawn from the NPT. I think that should Iran become overtly nuclear, the Saudis will definitely consider whether or not to withdraw from the NPT. And I think it's highly likely that they will develop nuclear weapons of their own. And again, I'm saying this because they actually declared it. So it's not, and I'm not making this huge leap of faith or an assumption, it's on the record.
Okay, so you believe that the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran is in this factor more important than the, let's say now maybe dying or diminishing rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the Arabs against Israel at this moment?
So again, Saudi Arabia doesn't particularly care about the Israeli nuclear weapons program. The country that has been the proponent is Egypt. I don't think the Saudis really care about it. And I actually think that, again, they would rather align themselves with the nuclear-armed Israel against Iran should Iran go nuclear than push for any disarmament deals. The Egyptians are different. The Egyptians still would like to push for a nuclear weapons free zone as a part of the WMD zone, free zone. And for the Egyptians, it is an important diplomatic initiative, but moderately so. So they haven't, left the NPT. They haven't adopted dramatic measures yet. Things may change. We have a government now in Israel which is likely to see itself on a path clashing with the Arab world. Maybe there'll be a clash with Egypt as well. I don't know, but it's definitely a possibility. Such clashes can actually fuel diplomatic initiatives, such as the one we discussed. So we'll see. But I have to say that there's no diplomatic initiative which will, make Israel relinquish its nuclear weapons program.
Okay, great. Thanks for that insight. So now let's move to the final part, because time presses us quite hard. And so let's talk about, I know you've just kind of answered the question, that there is no kind of diplomatic pressure that could sway Israel to give up its nuclear weapons. But if so, is there any possibility? Do you foresee a possibility that Israel could somehow, in some way, actually join the NPT and work towards a nuclear disarmament? And if so, under what conditions? Or do you think that the situation is just not right and that it's not possible in foreseeable future?
So maybe I'll surprise you, but Israel's official policy is to work towards disarmament and eventually join the NPT. That's the official policy. Israel in 1981, after the Iraq raid, submitted a proposal to the UN, basically proposing the creation of a nuclear weapons free zone. But, and this is important, the Israeli policy is that such a zone can be established once stability and peace in the region has been established. And the understanding is that the Israeli view is that they'd like to see stable peace for 50 years or so. So once we've enjoyed stability for 50 years, then if I translate this policy to applicable terms, Israel would actually relinquish its nuclear weapons and join the NPT. So that's the official policy. These are the conditions. They're actually quite simple we can go into the technicalities, but that's the principle, and it's not difficult to understand. I think what Israel is very concerned with is something we haven't touched in our podcast interview as of yet, is the renewal of what we call, colloquially speaking, the Bush push, or President Bush Senior, Bush 41st, arms control initiative declared in May 91. So what happened just after the Gulf War is that Bush Senior, Bush 41st, declared an initiative which included a nuclear element in it. He basically wanted all the countries in the Middle East to join the NPT and work to create a nuclear free zone, and there were other elements there. So the Israelis were very, very concerned that Bush, should he be elected in 92, would actually really, really press down on Dimona and press down on the Israelis as a part of his attempt to create a new nuclear order in the Middle East. But history had a different plan. Clinton won, the Oslo peace process became the primary motivation. Everything changed in the Israeli-US discourse and in the Middle East. The question is, are we likely to see a president which would adopt a similar policy like Bush Senior? Should that be the case? Yes, Israel would definitely have to make, some hard choices. But, it's difficult to imagine that specific scenario, but there is a scenario in which a president like Bush Senior would promote, such policies. And Bush wasn't a fan of Israel, and the relationship with the Israeli leadership was very strenuous. So that would also have to play a part in such a scenario.
Yeah, great. You basically answered the second point I was about to ask you, and that was the role of the US in the whole process of actually pushing Israel towards NPT as its closest ally, definitely in global politics. So you've answered that with the second part of your talk. So maybe my colleague will just ask one last question, and we can end it on that note.
Yeah. Okay, when we were talking about the US presidents, my question is, which administration, the Bidens or Trumps, did better job in non-proliferation in the region?
Well, Biden is just in the middle. So, but Trump was so bad, his decision to withdraw from the Iran deal under Netanyahu's behest was so detrimental to Israel's security, so bad that he has to win. Like, no one can be as bad as Trump.
Okay, great. So I think we actually managed to fit into the time frame we were actually given for the podcast. So I want to sincerely thank you for finding time in your busy schedule for two boys from college in Prague. So thank you very much for that, Dr. Rabinowitz. It's been a pleasure. And that concludes our podcast on the topic of Israeli nuclear program and weapons. We hope you have enjoyed listening to it or watching it on YouTube. And who knows, maybe we will come up with something once again.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you, guys. Enjoy. Good luck. Bye-bye.